May 5th, 1945. Austria. The war in Europe had 72 hours left. Hitler was dead. The German army was surrendering in waves across a continent that had spent 6 years destroying itself. And high in the Tyrolean Alps, on a hill above a small Austrian town, something was happening that had never happened before in the entire war and would never happen again. If you had looked through binoculars at the walls of Castle Itter that morning, you would have seen American soldiers manning machine guns, and standing next to them, shoulder to shoulder, armed and firing, were German soldiers. Not prisoners, not men under duress. Soldiers in Wehrmacht uniforms, fighting voluntarily, choosing their targets and pulling their triggers. Below the castle walls, climbing the hill through the morning fog, there were the men they were all shooting at, a fanatical SS division that had come to kill everyone inside. The Americans and the Germans had one Sherman tank between them, limited ammunition, crumbling medieval walls, and a collection of elderly French politicians who had spent the last several years arguing with each other about who had been more responsible for France's collapse. What they were protecting, together, was each other's lives. And leading this arrangement was an American captain who looked like he'd been sent from central casting, and a German major who just wanted the war to be over so he could go home. This is the only battle in World War II in which the United States Army and the German Army fought as allies. It happened in the last week of the war, in a medieval castle in the Austrian Alps, and almost nobody has heard of it. To understand how it happened, you have to start with who was inside the castle and why they were there. Castle Itter was not a standard prison camp. The Nazis had a category of prisoner they called Ehrenhäftlinge, honor prisoners, high-profile figures whose value was political rather than economic. You didn't work these people to death. You kept them alive because they might be useful, as bargaining chips, as leverage, as proof that Germany was still a civilization rather than a killing machine. Castle Itter, in the Tyrolean Alps, was where the Nazis kept the most valuable French prisoners in their collection. Inside the castle were men who had run France. Édouard Daladier, the former prime minister who had signed the Munich Agreement in 1938. Paul Reynaud, another former prime minister, the man who had been in power when France fell in 1940. General Maxime Weygand, former supreme commander of the French army. Michel Clemenceau, son of the legendary World War I Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau. Marie-Agnès Caillot, the sister of Charles de Gaulle. Jean Borotra, one of the most famous tennis players in the world, a 4-time Grand Slam champion who had served in the Vichy government. And tennis star Borotra's presence alongside politicians who despised the Vichy regime tells you something about the social dynamics inside those walls. These people hated the Germans who had imprisoned them, but many of them also hated each other. They had spent years in close proximity arguing about French politics, assigning blame for the defeat, debating what should have been done differently in 1940. The castle was a luxury cage full of people with too much history and too little space. By early May 1945, the SS garrison that had been guarding them was getting nervous in a very specific way. The commander at Castle Itter was an SS officer named Sebastian Wimmer, and Wimmer understood his situation with the clarity that comes from knowing the war is lost and calculating what that means for you personally. He had orders from Himmler: no prisoner leaves alive. But he also knew that following those orders would guarantee he spent the rest of his life in an Allied prison, assuming he survived long enough to reach one. On May 3rd, Wimmer made his decision. He gathered the SS garrison, and they left. They walked away from the castle and disappeared into the Alps, leaving the French prisoners behind with the weapons the guards hadn't bothered to take, and no plan for what happened next. The French IPs were suddenly free. They were also completely trapped. The forests surrounding Castle Itter were full of soldiers from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. True believers, fanatical holdouts who were still executing people who tried to surrender in the final days of the war. These were men who had received no message from reality that the Reich was finished, or who had received the message and chosen to reject it. If the French politicians walked out of the castle gates, the SS would massacre them within minutes. The castle walls were the only thing between the most important French prisoners in Germany and a killing squad that had no reason left to show restraint. The prisoners armed themselves with the weapons the garrison had left behind. But they were elderly statesmen and politicians, not soldiers, and they were surrounded. They needed help from somewhere that didn't yet know they existed. Help arrived by bicycle. A Czech cook named Andreas Krobot, who had been working in the castle, volunteered to try to get through the SS lines to find the Americans. He got on a bicycle and rode through the woods, and somehow made it to the town of Wörgl a few miles away, where he found Major Josef Gangl. Gangl was a Wehrmacht officer, a regular German army soldier, not SS, and his situation in the final days of the war was complicated in ways that tell you a great deal about what the German military actually looked like by May 1945. He was a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front, a man who had fought for Germany across years of brutal combat in Russia and survived it. He was also quietly, secretly, anti-Nazi. He had been making contact with the Austrian resistance movement, passing information, looking for ways to end the killing before it consumed everyone around him. He wanted to surrender to the Americans. He wanted to save the town of Wörgl from the SS officers who were planning to blow up its bridges and fight a pointless last battle that would accomplish nothing except killing more people. He was looking for someone to hand the situation to. And then the Czech cook arrived on his bicycle and told him about the castle. Gangl faced the kind of decision that defines a person permanently. He couldn't fight the SS with the men he had. Not enough of them, not well enough armed. But he couldn't let the SS execute a group of French leaders in a medieval castle in the last week of the war and call it someone else's problem. He thought about Germany's honor, which had been in the process of being destroyed for 12 years by the people now climbing the hill toward Castle Itter. He thought about his men, who were exhausted and wanted to go home. He thought about what the right thing actually was, stripped of politics and ideology and the accumulated weight of the uniform he was wearing. He grabbed a white flag. He got into his Kübelwagen, the German equivalent of a jeep, and he drove toward the American lines. 8 miles away, in the town of Kufstein, Captain John Lee was doing what American tank commanders did when they had a moment to breathe. He was resting his crew and trying to keep his vehicle functional. Lee was everything the Hollywood version of an American officer was supposed to be: cigar-chomping, loud, intensely competent, the kind of man his soldiers would follow anywhere because he projected the specific confidence of someone who has already done the math and knows things are going to be fine. His tank was a Sherman named Besotten Jenny, and she had carried him across a considerable amount of Europe already. A German car appeared with a white flag. Lee put his hand on his pistol. Gangl climbed out and saluted. He explained the situation in the limited English he had, and Lee listened to a German army major standing in front of him asking to join forces to rescue French politicians from the SS in an Austrian castle. It sounded exactly like a trap. Lee chewed his cigar and looked at the map and looked at Gangl and made his decision. All right, Fritz, let's go get them. He radioed his headquarters to inform them he was taking a rescue mission to Castle Itter with a German major. His superiors thought he had lost his mind. They gave him the green light anyway. Lee assembled what he had available: 2 Sherman tanks, 7 infantrymen, and Gangl's truck full of Wehrmacht soldiers. The convoy that formed up on the road outside Kufstein that afternoon was the strangest collection of military hardware and personnel anyone had seen in 6 years of war. An American Sherman tank in the lead, a German truck behind it. men in American uniforms and men in Wehrmacht uniforms, all moving in the same direction for the same reason, through territory controlled by people who would happily kill all of them. Or they drove up the winding mountain road toward Castle Itter and ran into SS roadblocks on the way. The Besotten Jenny dealt with them the way a Sherman deals with roadblocks, directly and conclusively. Gangl's soldiers fired their rifles at the SS troops alongside the American crew. They fought their way up the mountain and through the castle gate. The French VIPs came out to meet them. They had been expecting a relief force. What they saw was one tank, 7 Americans, and a contingent of Germans. Daladier and Reynaud, 2 former prime ministers of France, looked at this arrangement and asked the obvious question: where was the rest of the army? Captain Lee climbed down from the Besotten Jenny, cigar in hand, and gave them the answer. I am it. Ein Lee took command with the specific authority of a man who is the only person present capable of solving the immediate problem and knows it. He was a captain giving orders to former prime ministers and generals, and nobody argued with him because the alternative was dying. He positioned the Besotten Jenny at the main gate, barrel aimed at the road below. He placed his American infantry in the towers. He positioned Gangl's Wehrmacht soldiers on the walls. He told Gangl to watch the south wall and told his own gunner to watch the gate. Then he waited for morning. That night, for the first time in 5 years, American and German soldiers shared cigarettes and food and checked each other's weapons. They didn't talk about politics or ideology or what had happened between their countries. They talked about the practical things: fields of fire, ammunition counts, what the SS was likely to do when the sun came up. They were going to fight together in the morning, and some of them were going to die, and they all understood this with the clarity that comes from having been soldiers long enough to stop pretending. May 5th. The fog lifted. The first shot came from below. Approximately 150 soldiers from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadiers moved up the hill with anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine guns. They were furious in the specific way that true believers are furious when confronted with the collapse of everything they believed in. And seeing Wehrmacht soldiers on those castle walls, German men in German uniforms shooting at them, was a provocation that went beyond military calculation. To the SS, Gangl and his men were traitors. But the SS focused their fire on the castle with the intensity of men who had decided that if the war was ending anyway, everyone who had contributed to its failure was going to die with it. The ancient stone walls of Castle Itter had been built to withstand medieval weapons. They absorbed the small arms fire reasonably well. The 88mm anti-tank gun was a different problem. The SS aimed it at the gate, at the Besotten Jenny, and fired. The shell hit. The Besotten Jenny burst into flames. The crew bailed out just in time with their lives and nothing else. Their only armored vehicle, their only heavy weapon, was gone. Captain Lee ran from position to position in the castle courtyard, keeping his voice calm and his cigar in his mouth. His ammunition count was dropping every minute. The SS were advancing up the hill, inching closer to the walls. They're preparing for a final assault that would overwhelm the defenders through sheer numbers. He told his men, "Don't worry, they have to come through the gate, and we'll pile them up like cordwood." On the south wall, Major Gangl was directing fire when he noticed that former Prime Minister Paul Reynaud had moved into an exposed position, standing in the open, firing a rifle, making himself an obvious target. Gangl ran to him. "Get down!" he shouted, and shoved Reynaud out of the line of fire. A sniper's bullet hit Gangl in the chest. He fell. He died in the courtyard of an Austrian castle, wearing a German uniform, shot by German soldiers, having just saved a French politician's life. He was the only defender killed in the Battle of Castle Itter. Yet the hero of the day was a German fighting against his own country's most fanatical soldiers, because he had decided, somewhere along the way, that honor was more important than uniform. By noon, the ammunition was almost gone. The tank was destroyed. The SS were massing for the final assault. Lee did the calculation and understood that they had perhaps 1 more hour before the numbers overwhelmed them. The radio in the Besotten, Jenny had burned with the tank. He had no way to call for help. Jean Borotra stepped forward. The tennis player, 4-time Grand Slam champion, former French sporting hero, a man in his mid-40s who had spent the war in various states of political compromise and imprisonment. He said, "I will go. I am fast. I can run." He didn't wait for permission. He vaulted over the castle wall, dropped to the ground outside, and started running across the open field below the castle while the SS fired at him. Bullets hit the dirt around his feet. He dodged and kept running, reached the tree line, disappeared into the forest, and ran for miles until he found an American relief column moving up the road toward Itter. He ran up to the lead tank, breathing hard, and gasped out what was happening at the castle. "You must hurry." Back at the castle, the SS were at the gate. They were blowing it open. Lee told his men to fix bayonets and prepared to fight hand-to-hand in the courtyard. The German soldiers checked their magazines. Empty. Then came the sound of engines from the road below. Not the SS. The 142nd Infantry Regiment, American soldiers, Sherman tanks coming around the bend at speed. They opened fire on the SS positions. But the SS found themselves caught between the castle defenders above and fresh American troops below, and the calculation that had seemed straightforward an hour earlier suddenly reversed completely. They scattered into the forest. The siege was over. The American relief soldiers ran through the gate and found Lee standing in the courtyard, face black with smoke, cigar still going. He looked at the relief commander and said, "What took you so long? The French VIPs were transported to safety. The war in Europe ended 3 days later. Captain John Lee received the Distinguished Service Cross and went home to New York, where he opened a hotel and lived for decades without bragging about what he had done in the Austrian Alps on May 5, 1945. When people eventually tracked him down and asked about the battle, he described it the same way every time. "It was the weirdest thing I ever saw," he said. "Me and the Krauts fighting side by side." He said it with the slight smile of a man who has seen enough of the world to know that the strangest stories are almost always the true ones. Major Josef Gangl was buried in the town of Wörgl. Austria has not forgotten him. A street bears his name. A memorial marks where he fell. He occupies a complicated place in the history of the war. A German officer, a Wehrmacht soldier, a man who had served the regime that murdered millions, who in the final hours of that regime's existence chose to drive toward the Americans with a white flag and die pushing a French politician out of a sniper's line of fire. Whether that makes him a traitor to Germany or a hero to humanity is a question that different people answer differently. The Austrians who named a street after him have made their position clear. The Battle of Castle Itter has no real parallel in the history of the Second World War. There were moments of unexpected mercy, individual acts of decency across enemy lines, soldiers who chose humanity over orders in isolated and unremarked ways throughout the conflict. But a formal military alliance, however improvised and brief, between American and German forces fighting together against a common enemy on the last weekend of the war in Europe, that happened exactly once, in a medieval castle in the Tyrolean Alps, but with 1 Sherman tank and 7 American infantrymen and a truck full of Wehrmacht soldiers who had decided that the SS was the real enemy. The castle still stands on its hill above the town. The road below it is quiet now. If you drive up on a clear day, you can see the walls where the machine guns were, the gate where the Besotten Jenny burned, the courtyard where Gangl fell. The stone is old enough that it holds no visible record of what happened there. You have to know to look. Most people don't know to look. That's the thing about the last days of a war. History is moving so fast, so much is ending simultaneously, that the specific and remarkable gets buried under the general and enormous. The fall of Berlin, the death of Hitler, the liberation of the camps, the formal surrender. These are the events that fill the final chapter. And the Battle of Castle Itter is a footnote in the footnotes, a story that sounds invented, that requires the listener to suspend their assumptions about how wars work and who fights whom and what people are capable of choosing when the structure that defines their choices is collapsing around them. Gangl chose. Lee chose. Even the tennis player chose, vaulting over a wall into a field full of SS soldiers because he was fast and someone had to go. The French politicians chose to pick up the rifles the fleeing SS guards had left behind and stand at the windows and fire. Nobody in that castle on May 5, 1945, was required by any circumstance to do what they did. The war was effectively over. The rational calculation in every case pointed somewhere quieter and safer. They chose the harder thing anyway. They chose it together, or to cross every line that the previous 6 years had told them were permanent and defining and absolute. And the result was the only battle in the Second World War where American and German soldiers fought as allies, held a medieval castle against the SS for most of a day with one tank and a tennis player, and won.